Hey, I'm Jim Sear.
And I'm Jocelyn and I.
And you're listening to the Avoiding Chores podcast,
where we talk about a bunch of things that I think in this case happened in the past.
That's right, Jocelyn. You know what? I haven't started to binge on the latest Stranger Things Season 2 on Netflix here, but you brought up something very interesting the other day.
Well, there's clearly a resurgence of the 80s in popular culture right now, and I think Stranger Things was one of the first things that captured people's imaginations and became really popular. But I just finished reading a book called Ready Player One, and for people that haven't read the book, it's also being made into a movie by Steven Spielberg, also a product of the 80s, really. And the book is, and I won't tell you the story of the book, it doesn't matter, but really it's a premise to talk about all things 80s, from talking about movies like The Goonies and TV shows like Knight Rider and Family Ties, and bands like Rush are featured prominently in the book and in the movie as well. It's kind of cool. The 80s, and you and I are products of the 80s, so
exactly.
So it's coming back big time.
And you put up a very good point here, and because everything, I find, like, even the other day I started playing a game on my Apple TV, which is an old shoot 'em up airplane game, very similar to Glacken or one of these just scrolling games.
Yeah.
Just Zaxxon or whatever you want.
Oh yeah, Zaxxon. I remember that one.
But this brings up a very good point here, which is what is the best year of the 80s?
Oh, wow. Best year of the... I mean, that would be so debatable. The 80s is really the decade for me where I went through high school, graduated high school, really got, my first job, bought my first car. And actually, I got the first job in the industry that I'm still working in back in '89 at the tail end of the '80s. So,
wow.
So I don't know. Like the year I got my first car certainly stands out to me as a cool one.
Well, you know what? I graduated high school. I got my driver's license. As I go back into the years, that's where most of the good schooling years, that was all of the 80s. And I grew up along the, this is a funny story. I grew up along the U.S. and Canadian border. So I had TV and radio from U.S., right? So I grew up listening to American Top 40, American TV channels from the 80s. And by the time I got into the 90s, to get into university in Canada, I was like, I have no idea who you're talking about for these English Canadian artists. I have no idea who's Rush, who's The Box, who's
Corey Hart,
tragically hit Corey Hart. Who are these guys, right?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, because even though I was born and raised in Montreal, I spent all my summers just across the border in the U.S. So we were very much exposed to U.S. pop culture as well. And but there was enough of an influence, and I listened to radio in Montreal. I mean, in a big city, and CanCon determined that I was listening, obviously, to some of the Canadian music being made at the time.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, this is a good one here. So I'm just thinking back here, back to, instead of trying to choose what was the best year of the 80s, maybe we can do this in a different series of podcasts. But how about for tonight, we just focus on, some big stuff in the 80s, that happened, which would explain why we're seeing this resurgence here. So I'm just thinking back, and I'm just thinking, Pac-Man was released in the 80s. Huge game.
Really, video games in general. And going back to my thing about Ready Player One, video games and the early ones, and even the ones based on computers and text adventures, all of those are featured prominently in the book, and I imagine will be in the movie as well. One of the first things I remember from the 80s that actually shocked me is John Lennon being shot.
Oh, really?
That happened really early in 1980, right?
Wow. You know what? The only thing I remember from that early, like 1980 range, is looking at National Geographic magazines at Mount St. Helens, the volcano eruption back in Washington State. It's something that we don't really hear about now, but if you go back and maybe if you Google back some of the images, that was a devastating eruption that just wiped the town of, I think it was called Helens in Washington State. It's crazy.
Yeah,
pictures.
and if it happened in today's world, I mean, Twitter would be nonstop about it for days and days and days, and CNN would be on site probably with reporters, braving the lava, instead of the hurricane.
Just think of it. I had to wait, or I waited, or I wasn't aware of it until like a month later when the magazine showed up in the mail.
Yeah, no kidding.
Crazy, huh?
Yeah, it was different time. The other thing I remember, and talking about computers and video games, I still vividly remember the controversy a little bit when Time Magazine, which they always named their Man of the Year. First of all, that wouldn't happen anymore. The Man of the Year is the Person of the Year now, but they named the computer their Man of the Year in 1982.
Wow. 1982. The only thing I remember is watching Sunday nights, The Wonderful World of Disney on TV, watching little Mickey Mouse cartoons and little clips from the old Disney movies. Epcot Center, the World of Tomorrow, that geodesic dome and stuff like that. That's one of the big things I remember from that.
There was so much stuff. Remember when the famine in Ethiopia happened and Band-Aid in the UK did Do They Know It's Christmas, and then it was in the US with USA for Africa. And,
oh my Lord!
Yeah,
the big tribute songs, right?
Huge.
Every country had to have their own lineup of singers to do a fundraiser song, and Canada was not left behind.
Tears Are Not Enough.
Exactly.
Yep.
Huge.
Yeah, it was that just started really in the 80s, that kind of trend. Yeah, it was really interesting.
And let's see, if I was just keep thinking back here, what was going on here, 86 is, that was a big year too, I remember we had a half day of school. I was downstairs in the basement watching TV, eating some hot dogs and stuff, playing with my little, DC superhero figurines and stuff because, I was still young back then. But watching on TV, the Space Shuttle Challenger.
Wow.
Take off and explode on flight. Huge. I mean, just trying to think, back then where every time a rocket got launched, today now we're, SpaceX, you just read about it. SpaceX flies up and then lands on a cart and we see maybe a little blurb on it. But, that was live TV viewing back then, right?
Absolutely. And maybe one of the things to close out the 80s, and this one happened in 89, and I think it was a big deal for everybody, was seeing Ronald Reagan say to Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, and the Berlin Wall eventually coming down right in 89 at the tail end of the 80s.
And you know what? That's something that a few years after, probably in the mid-90s, where you start to see some of these movies from East Germany coming out, and a lot of these movies about trying to get across the wall, and a lot of democracy, a lot of revolt in the world. The Tiananmen Square in China, that happened also in '89. There was a lot of demonstrations, a lot of stuff. I don't want to say the New World Order, but the New World Order was when that phrase was coming around. It was
absolutely. It was the end of the Cold War. It was a big deal, and like we had lived through 2 decades of with the 70s, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Reagan's Star Wars, and like I remember in school doing nuclear drills and hiding under your desk is really going to help you, but that's what we were taught. I mean, I can't even imagine today's kids growing up with that.
Well, and we go back one last thing in the 80s. You said something that reminded me of the movie War Games, where there were I forget the name. Matthew Broderick was playing with this computer, and then all of a sudden thinks it's a real nuclear war, and all these launch sites, and where I grew up was not far from one of the launch sites in Maine, Loring Air Force Base, where we had a couple of silos there, one of the most northern in the U.S. For B-52 bombers to take off, or B-2 bombers, whatever. And, to know that it was a different time. I know things are in the news now, are kind of are coming up with terms of nuclear, conflicts and stuff like that. But you think about the 80s, that was close to, maybe not as bad in as it was in 60s or 70s or something like that. But I mean, we definitely lived in a different time where there was a while that you didn't know, and the worst part, you had that TV miniseries that pretended that there was a nuclear war, and if you didn't catch it, you'd be like, "What the hell's happening?"
Yeah, what was it called again? I can't remember. We'll have to. I think we're going to do a podcast on every single year here of the 80s because we have too much meat, but I think we can talk about it then. But hey, listen, circling back with how we started this podcast, which was about the resurgence of the 80s, and it's funny that the last thing you mentioned is the movie War Games, because it does figure prominently in one of the first things we mentioned, the book Ready Player One. If you guys haven't read it, go read it. If you're fans of the 80s or just reminisce fondly about that decade, you'll love the book. It's for geeks too, by the way.
All right. So, hey, you know what? I'm just going to go and try to get that tonight. All right. I think that will do it for tonight, Jocelyn. And make sure, folks, if you like this episode, make sure you give us 5 stars or review on your favorite podcast apps, such as Apple, iTunes, or Stitcher. Or you can find us on Facebook, Twitter. Just search for Avoiding Chores. Or you can look at past episodes or subscribe to the podcast feed at avoidingchores.com.